We're looking at question 32 in this paragraph. I'm going to read the whole paragraph for context, and then we'll go through the choices and determine what kind of question this is. Brancusi, in turn, sued the U.S. government, aiming to score recognition of his sculpture as art. The resultant 1927 court case, Brancusi v. United States, attempted to answer for the American public the question of whether abstract works like Brancusi's should be considered art. After hearing a lineup of well-known, famous art critics testify to the aesthetic value and originality of non-representational art like Bird in Space, the court's ruling was in favor of Brancusi. Okay, so the court's ruling was in favor of Brancusi is the underlined part. The choices are A, no change, which is what I just said. B, the ruling of the court was in favor of Brancusi. C, the court ruled in favor of Brancusi. And D, Brancusi was the favorable receiver of the court's ruling. So all of these options are saying nearly the same thing, but in different orders and different configurations, right? Ultimately, this is about a court ruling that determined that Brancusi's sculpture was art. We have that context from the paragraph. So what are we being asked to figure out here? Well, the lead-in to the underlined portion is this big introductory comma, right? After hearing a lineup of well-known famous art critics testify to the aesthetic value and originality of non-representational art like Bird in Space, comma. So that whole thing is one big description. And now I know what this question is asking, because we have to figure out what word that introductory descriptive phrase is describing. We're being asked to correct an error in modifier placement. Modifiers are words like adjectives and adverbs, but they can also be longer phrases, like this big explanatory comma in this question. Modifier placement is the principle that modifiers must appear directly next to the nouns they describe. Let me show you what I mean, and then give you a few top tips for approaching questions like this, and then we'll work through this question together. An example of a modifier placement error could look like this. Flashing white blue lightning and ringing out with peals of thunder, the little rabbit sought shelter from the raging storm. Everything that comes before this comma here after thunder, this whole phrase, is actually describing rabbit right now. Now, logically, we know that rabbits do not emit lightning and thunder. The context of the sentence tells us that storm is the noun that the modifying phrase ought to be describing. But in order for the sentence to function logically, we need to rearrange this independent clause here so that we're no longer talking about some sort of impossible thunder bunny, as much fun as that sounds. We need to make sure that the modifier is next to the thing it describes. So a logical way to render this sentence is, flashing white blue lightning and ringing out with peals of thunder, the storm raged as the little rabbit sought shelter. Right, so now everything that comes before this comma is now describing storm, which makes much more logical sense. What we just saw is one of the three kinds of modifier placement errors you're going to see on the test. The Thunder Bunny error is an example of something that can go wrong with an introductory modifying phrase. Right, that's everything from the word flashing to the word thunder. It's this introduction that modifies the thing that comes after it, which is, in the correct version, the storm. Top tip number 1, look out for possessive nouns. Struggling to adjust his bright yellow rain slicker, the fisherman's catch flopped on the deck as he steadied himself. You see, fisherman's is being possessive there. It's behaving like an adjective. The first noun next to the modifying phrase, struggling to adjust his bright yellow rain slicker, is actually catch, which is to say, a fish. And that's illogical. It doesn't seem likely that a fish would be wearing a bright yellow rain slicker. We want to rearrange the sentence so it's about the fisherman, like so. Struggling to adjust his bright yellow rain slicker, the fisherman steadied himself as his catch flopped on the deck. Top tip number 2, focus on what you can change. On the test, only a portion of the sentence will be underlined for you to revise. So if the modifier isn't the part that's modified, you're going to have to move the noun, which would be underlined. And if the noun isn't underlined, then the modifier is, and that means you're going to have to move the modifier to find the answer. So with that in mind, let's return to our worked example. And if you want to take a crack at this question, pause the video now and go for it. Okay, now I'll take a shot. Top tip number 1, look out for possessive nouns. So this is a good way to look out for questions like these. When you see a possessive noun, flag it in your mind. So we have it right here in the no change option, right? The way it appears in the passage is the court's ruling, which means that the first noun to come after that big long modifying phrase, this thing here, is actually the word ruling. And that means that this sentence is actually saying that the ruling heard testimony from art critics, which isn't logical. So we can cross off option A. And we can cross off B too, because it also says the ruling heard testimony. So that leaves us with C and D. The court ruled, and Brancusi was the favorable receiver of the court's ruling. Now, D uses favorable in a different way than the rest of the choices do, using it to describe Brancusi rather than the court ruling. It's also wordy and awkwardly phrased, and while Brancusi might have been in the courtroom to hear testimony, choice D changes the meaning of the sentence by obscuring the outcome of the court case. The court issued the ruling, the court heard testimony, the thing described should be the court, which is why we can knock out D, leaving C as our answer. Let's review the strategy here. So, number 1, identify the question type. I identified that this was a modifier placement question because of the choices, and because of the presence of that possessive noun. And then I considered which part of the sentence was available for me to change. When the noun is underlined, you change the noun. When the modifier is underlined, you change the modifier. And finally, remember the principle. The noun should go right next to the thing that's modifying it. If you want to learn more, check out the Modifier Placement Quick Guide on the Tips and Strategies tab of our website. That's khanacademy.org/SAT.